All right, so I'm going to start recording. All right, so everybody please stay muted. Hey everyone, please be aware we are recording this program to be archived on our YouTube channel, which will be available to be viewed probably sometime tomorrow. Welcome to another educational and inspiring AAM workshop. This workshop is entitled A Fur-Free Future, How We End the Fur Trade. From provocative anti-fur campaigns that led to awareness, but no policy, to bridging the gap between fashion companies and animal rights activists, the fur-free movement has been undermining the fur industry since the 1980s. In response to the growing consumer demand for sustainable and ethical products, the fashion world has seemingly gone fur-free, opting for more innovative alternatives. Legislators at city, state, and federal levels are now looking to align policy with consumer and corporate values by introducing bans on new fur sales. Tonight, PJ Smith, Director of Fashion Policy for the HSUS, discusses the fur-free movement today and where we will go from here to ensure that the fur industry is finally relegated to the history books once and for all. My name is Julia Novak. I'm your moderator. I'm a mentor and a team member for the Animal Activism Mentorship. I'm located in Virginia, and I've been a vegan and activist for about 15 years now. AAM's mission is to eradicate violence and build a culture of empathy and compassion, which ultimately results in animal liberation. We strive to build a global community of activists through our free online program that pairs experienced activists with aspiring activists. Through one-on-one mentoring, we strive to generate an increased number of effective activists worldwide because we know this movement needs more activists. Additionally, we offer free workshops that train and educate our mentors, mentees, and the public on various aspects of AR activism. We have a podcast called the Animal Liberation Hour, and we host a large-scale in-person activism events. AAM is also proud to be fueled by Farm and the Farm Animal Rights Movement, one of the oldest AR organizations in the country. If you are interested in applying to become a mentor or mentee and want to get involved or to donate, please visit our website, animalactivismmentorship.com, and follow both AAM and Farm on social media. All right, now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, PJ Smith, is Director of Fashion Policy at the Humane Society of the United States. For more than a decade, PJ has worked with dozens of top fashion companies, including ELLE magazine, Kering, Prada, Dolce Gabbana, Chanel, Michael Kors, and Farfetch to set policies that have reformed supply chains and revolutionized the way the fashion industry views animals. In 2010, PJ helped pass the Federal Truth in Fur Labeling Act, which ensures clear and proper labeling for all fur products sold in the US. And in 2019, he was instrumental in the California becoming the first state to phase out new fur sales. He resides in Austin, Texas. All right, proud to introduce PJ, and I'm going to mute and pass it over to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Julia. Again, Julia and I have known each other for over a decade, and it's so great to see your face again. So, and that you get to introduce me. That's pretty amazing. So, hello, everybody. My name is PJ Smith, Director of Fashion Policy for the Humane Society of the United States for roughly 13 years now. And a little bit more about me. I was born and raised in Ohio. To a mother that was, I would say, an activist. She was a vegetarian when she found out what my grandpa was going to do to her cow friend, and as a teenager in rural Ohio became a vegetarian. And she used to, before he would go out hunting, she would go out with pots and pans and pee all around the forest to scare off the deer, and it used to piss off my grandpa. And so she raised her 3 kids vegetarian, and so it's always been this thing that's been part of my life. And um, I'm really happy to just be on the forefronts with all of you, to make the world a better place for animals. So I'm going to talk about the fur trade today, and I'll share my screen now. Just make sure we can do that. All right, good. All right, let me move this over. All right, so ending the fur trade. Just for a loose agenda of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to give some background on the fur trade, really what the current situation is, and where we're going to go from here. So it's as simple as that. And I just kind of, I know if you're on this call, you're going to know a lot about the fur trade and why it's a horrible, terrible industry. But I hope to just give some talking points that I think I've found to be the most effective over the years, and maybe some context of where those talking points come from. So we say every year 100 million animals are raised and killed for the fur trade. That's, we say 100 million despite numbers dropping pretty rapidly across the world. So if we would add up the number of animals that are farmed for fur, it's less than 100 million. But what that number doesn't include, and why we still say 100 million, is because of rabbits. We don't count rabbits as part of that number. And rabbits are raised for meat, they're raised for fur, and they're raised for both meat and fur. So we're pretty comfortable. We could be hundreds of billions, closer to 1 billion animals if we were to include rabbits in that, but we feel comfortable saying 100 million. China is still the largest producer. It's still the largest buyer of fur. And one of the at heart of why this is a really cruel industry is that most of these animals are wild, essentially wild animals. They've been bred for pelt quality, pelt color, not necessarily some sort of domestication. And so when you put a wild animal in a cage where their natural behaviors, for this fox, is to dig. I mean, you can't even recognize this as a fox because it's been overbred to have as much fur as possible, to get as much money as possible. But the foxes are burrow naturally in wild, and mink are semi-aquatic. So you take away some of those natural behaviors, and they run miles and miles a day. You take away that natural behavior that leads to literally them going insane. So stereotypical behavior of pacing and head bobbing. They gnaw, they'll gnaw, cannibalism, and they'll self-mutilate themselves. It's a nightmare inside these fur factory farms. And then mink are killed by gassing, and raccoons, dogs, and foxes are killed by anal electrocution. This is done. I think this is important to just recognize. This is done because it's cheap and it doesn't damage the pelts, which is the #1 priority for these fur farmers. One thing that's really hard to fathom is that, like I mentioned, mink are semi-aquatic, so they can hold their breath for a really long time. And the fact that they are killed by gassing, which some might say is a better way to go than electrocution or blunt trauma to the head. But these mink, it takes like 2 or 3 times for them to gas because they can hold their breath for so long. So it literally is just, it's a horrible, horrible trade for animals. The rest of the industry, we say around 85-95% come from fur factory farms, and the rest of the industry comes from trapping. And every state, the United States is typically one of the top trapping countries in the world, and every state has a different check line. So some might be 24 hours. Some states have a law that says 72 hours every time the trapper has to check their line. And some states don't have any trap check line at all. So literally they can go days, weeks without food and water if they're held in these traps. That's where you find either the animal being killed by exposure, by another animal coming along, or they'll gnaw off their own limb to get out of these traps. Every year we find that either endangered species or threatened species or people's pets are caught in these traps. Born Free USA, um, last time I checked, they do a running sort of tally of all the pets that are killed every year in these traps that are meant to kill animals, catch animals for the fur trade. So these traps are indiscriminate. And the leg hold trap, as you see, that's holding the swift fox, has been banned or restricted heavily in over 100 countries, except for three. When those three countries, when Europe was looking to ban trapped fur imports in the early 2000s, three countries went to try to negotiate out of that, and they created the humane trapping standards, and those are Russia, the United States, and Canada. And those are the top three trapping countries in the world. There are other traps that are popular, snares, which are almost like nooses that the more the animal struggles, the more it will tighten and cut off the airflow. And then conibear traps, which kind of looks like squares or boxes. And they're meant to sever the spine as the animal walks through it. But for certain species, the traps are very specific for the size of animals. So it's generally placed near water for beavers. But if an animal of a different size was to walk through that, it would it'd be extremely painful. And again, we see dogs and cats killed by conibear traps every year as well. And as with all fur factory farming, all factory farms, there's going to be a heavy toll on the environment. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of animals. This is a fur farm in China in 2018. We're talking hundreds of thousands of animals that are stacked in these barns, where the waste runoff goes into the soil and in the waterways. There's whole communities that are surrounded by dead lakes because the runoff from the fur farms has created such phosphorus that it kills everything in that lake. That's just first step of the environmental impact. The second step is that how do you stop a rotting, pelt? How do you stop a pelt from skin rotting off of a hanger? And that's to use toxic chemicals like formaldehyde and chromium to prevent the skin from decaying. And so it's just a horrible industry for the environment. One thing that's really been keeping us busy in the last couple years is the link between the fur trade and COVID-19. Around April 2020, there was a couple fur farms in the Netherlands that there were outbreaks where the mink were tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, which is COVID-19 in humans, and it just exploded from there. Today we have over 470 fur farms in 12 countries, including here in the United States, that have been tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. And that same variant's been found in wild mink that are found and trapped near the fur farms. So once it gets into the wild and gets into the wild population, then I mean, it's going to continue to be a reservoir for different variants as it passes through these different species. And so mink were really the first species to be known that it can pass the variant from animal to human. Again, which creates reservoirs. Each fur farm is a reservoir for new variants. We know about 5 variants that have come from fur farms so far. But because of that, some good, some bad. The bad is that the Danish fur industry, which had 17 million mink, killed them all in one swoop because of this risk to their population and public health. But several countries have banned fur production, specifically mink fur production, because of that. And I believe we're going to see a bill in the United States that will hopefully end mink production here. Humane Society United States, obviously want to shine a spotlight into this trade. And so every year, I think going back to 2015, we've done an investigation on a fur farm, and we really focus on Finland because that's the country where the fur industry and brands that continue to sell fur, like LVMH, they say that they source from countries that have top animal welfare standards, and Finland is usually that country. So going in there and showing that it's no better, it's no worse than any other fur farm, in China included, is important. And then obviously we get into fur farms in China because it's the number one producer of fur. And this last year, or this current year, we did a trapping investigation that just showed the cruelty and that goes on in that trade. So the anti-fur movement of the 80s and 90s, it was definitely spurred by, provocative acts and campaigns, and it was taboo to wear fur. And I think I've spoken to many activists from that time period that were protesting, and they thought we won the day, where fur was done. Unfortunately, fur came back, and what came back more than it ever was before. And there was a few reasons why we saw that, and one of them is, according to the Open Philanthropy, that we saw this shift that happened after the anti-fur movement of the 80s and 90s, where towards animals that were raised and killed for meat, which just were higher numbers, and so that left a lot of those old anti-fur campaigns kind of dead in the water. Then this was something that I think is crucial, and why we didn't see a whole lot of lasting power from that time period, was the lack of any sort of corporate or public policy. Calvin Klein, I believe, was one of the only brands that went for free in the 80s and 90s. And Klein was I believe was another one, but it might have been early 2000. But that's it. I mean, there was this belief that fur was done, and there was so many protests and things, but that didn't lead to public policy, didn't lead to corporate policy. So I think that really created a door opening for that industry to really come back. And then another report from Open Philanthropy found that the fur industry kind of follows the global economic trends. Like we can look at this map and we can say in the 80s and 90s, where we thought the activism was changing the game, was also the fall of the Soviet Union, which was one of the top fur producers in the world. And there was a global financial crisis, which really hurt demand. Then when you see the numbers start going up, that's because China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, which quickly allowed them to be not only the top producer of fur in the world, but the top buyer of fur. And this latest decline, which I don't think is fully represented, because if you looked at with COVID, it dropped significantly, even more than you're seeing here at the end. But that still very much could be associated with China's really focus on anti-corruption, which they specifically say you can't purchase fur or give fur to government officials anymore, and obviously the downturn in Russia. But I do believe the corporate policy and the public policy that we're implementing is going to make sure that those numbers continue to decline and will never be able to come back as an acceptable trend. I just want to briefly cover how the Humane Society got involved with the fur issue. We were instrumental in 2000, working on the Dog and Cat Protection Act, which prevented dog and cat fur from being imported into the United States. But it wasn't until 2005 when this species, raccoon dog, was found, documented to be skinned alive in China. And it was done by two animal groups, East International and Swiss Animal Protection, that went in there into the fur markets in China and saw this specific species being skinned alive. And for the Humane Society, we started looking at what was this species, raccoon dog, and how was it coming into the United States and being sold. We were seeing labels on garments that would say Asiatic raccoon. Raccoon is a North American and in Europe species, not generally found in Asia, so that wouldn't make sense. We started seeing it come in as fin raccoon, different other trade names like Murmansky, Tanuki, depending on where it was coming from. So it was all over the board. But what we started to see that was the most startling was that retailers and brands were selling real fur, raccoon dog species specifically, and selling it as faux fur. And it was something that tried to bring a lot of attention to, this fact that, you know, these major brands, Tommy Hilfiger sold raccoon dog fur as faux fur, and he quickly went for free after that. Jay-Z, one of the dumbest business moments in history. We found that there was this loophole in the federal legislation that allowed fur that was valued at less than $150. So wouldn't include trim and palms on hat or palms on purses, didn't have to be on the label at all. And so you would get some copywriter that was putting the advertising on online, and he or she would see a label that would have, you know, acrylic, cotton, polyester, everything that's on the jacket. But it wouldn't see anything that mentioned fur. And so they would just assume that it was faux fur and then would label it or advertise it like that. Again, we tried to bring a lot of attention, and thankfully, in 2010, President Obama signed the Truth in Fur Labeling Act, which closed that loophole. Really a simple thing that I think made a huge impact. But by closing that loophole, he made sure that all fur, no matter the value, had to have the species and country origin on the label. Something that was really cool that happened after that was Switzerland went a step further, and they said, okay, if you want to sell fur in Switzerland, you have to have the species, country of origin, and how the animal was raised or killed on the label. So you're talking about if you want to sell a fur jacket in Switzerland, it would have to say raccoon dog from China, raised in a wire bottom cage, or coyote trapped in the wild from the United States. And I can tell you firsthand from talking to so many brands at that time period, they're not going to want to put that on a label, and they're just not going to sell fur in Switzerland anymore. I would say the EU in general is still lacking on fur labeling. And so I think they just have to say it has a parts of an animal on the jacket, no matter if it's leather or fur or shearling. So if it's, say, faux leather and real fur, it just has to say parts of an animal, includes parts of an animal. That goes for faux fur, real leather. So it can create a lot of confusion. But something happened beyond just having fur labeled correctly, so consumers had the right information. This working on this bill allowed HSUS to really get their foot in the door with a lot of the brands and retailers that previously, after years of being targeted for aggressive campaigns and things like that, just weren't. There was no dialogue between animal groups and fashion brands at the time. And to be really honest, like when we would go in there and we would say, we want to help you with your fur labeling, just so consumers knew what they were buying. Their next question was, can you help us find a humane source of fur? And I think what was an important part of my answer was that I didn't say that doesn't exist or no. I said, let's see if we can find it. I'll go along with this. And what we ended up seeing was that companies, when you sat down with them, when you went through every certification, every sort of standard the fur industry tries to promote and poke holes in their arguments, the companies quickly realized that there was really no way to humanely source fur. And we started seeing these companies just go up and up. I mean, I think Hugo Boss and Armani are really the big leaders in this latest wave of companies going for free, really leading to Gucci in 2017, which then after Gucci did it, like the dominoes started falling. One thing that also was happening around this time period was this idea of what luxury was changing. It now includes being innovative, socially responsible, environmentally friendly, and so this became a no-brainer for companies. Not only were they, getting positive reaction from going for free, but they were being rewarded on social media. When Gucci went for free, they posted that on their Instagram, and it ended up being, I think, their 5th most liked Instagram post of all time at that point. When Prada went for free, they posted that on Twitter, and it was their most liked tweet of all time. So you have these companies that are spending millions and millions of dollars on social media, influencers, and advertising, and they can just do well by doing good. And they were starting to see the benefits of that, and it was helping their bottom line as well. And that's where like Nordstrom going for free, their stock went up. So for future companies being able to go in there and say, hey, I can help your stock go up by doing good for animals is just, it's such an amazing talking point. Which leads me to corporate campaigns, which I know so many of you are maybe so many of you are in Chicago that are protesting, and I think that's an amazing thing. Focusing on Louis Vuitton, and I'll get to that in a second, my thoughts on that. But just some things that I've learned from doing a lot of corporate campaigns in my life. And there's a lot of ways to run a successful campaign, and a lot of things to consider of how to keep supporters engaged, how to find opportunities to escalate. And I'm sure, like I said, many of you have been involved in those kind of campaigns. But I think one of the first steps for me is understanding the company, understanding why we're sitting in a place where Kering, Gucci, and Balenciaga and Alexander McQueen, why are they for free and not LVMH? And one of the reasons is because Kering allowed their brands to have autonomy. They allowed each of them to make their own decision to go for free or not. LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton, Dior, Givenchy, so many of the major brands that are considered luxury, they don't get that autonomy. So LVMH would have to make that decision for its entire company. And so I think that that's just a lot more difficult than each brand kind of creating a pathway for a company like Kering to go for free. The way that companies tend to view issues like fur are like risk assessment. So they look back and they say, okay, what's the risk of our brand for selling this fur? Advocates, protesting, the cost to the environment, the cost to animals, and does that outweigh the amount of money that they make from the fur trade? I can tell you one of the retailers that recently went for free, they made over $50 million a year from their fur sales. So to recognize that that's something that they'd have to give up, I think is very difficult. But they also were at a point where the positive promotion we can balance that out. And another thing to consider when you're understanding a company is not a lot of companies want to be viewed as caving to activists. And so they need some sort of out. For one example, I know that, CAF was really instrumental, and so probably so many others in getting Oscar de la Renta to go for free. But what was interesting was the brand announced that, months later with Billie Eilish as the reason that they went for free. So they specifically found a way to not, say that it was because of protests or anything like that. So there's a variety of issues or variety of approaches that can be effective. I know in HSUS, we focus a lot on shareholder proposals, but there's social media campaigns. One thing that we think is super effective is calling companies, reaching them in their offices and reaching the right people. I can't tell you the amount of time I've spent over the last decade of just looking for emails for CEOs and executives, because I think it's really effective to reach those individuals and let it trickle down from there. And one of the campaigns we worked on was Prada, and it's a good example of having different approaches, where in the United States, we asked our supporters to, call and post on social media and email through alerts. But in other countries, we're part of the Fur Free Alliance, which is roughly, I think, 50 organizations from 25 countries around the world. So there's a lot of strength in numbers, which is really, really important for a campaign as well. But some countries, some of the organizations were protesting in front of the stores. And one example I thought was really fun was Four Paws in Germany. They, outside of a Prada store, they did a dog runway show outside of the Prada store and invited a whole bunch of media. and the media ended up coming, and the entire time they talked about how Prada wasn't fur free. So it was really, really effective. And another thing that, and I mentioned having an exit strategy, I think is good, because some of these campaigns can go on for a very long time. I'm sure many of you know. But one thing that I think was a good learning experience with the product campaign was that we focused the whole corporate campaign around Fashion Week. And so that, I mean, when it was in New York, the Humane Society and so many US organizations were contacting Prada. And then it just shifted to the UK, and then it just shifted to Milan, and then it just shifted to Paris. And one cool opportunity was that, we'll be back next Fashion Week, and we'll be back after the Fashion Week after that. So it gave you time to recoup and have that open dialogue, which like I said, is super important. I did say I was going to mention LVMH. It's also good to recognize that there are several other brands that haven't gone for free, like Max Mara or Roberto Cavalli or Philippine or Ferragamo or Hermes. All good companies to focus on. But it's pretty clear that the campaigning is effective right now against LVMH and the strategy that you all have put into place. I've never seen a company make announcements about how they're working on lab grown fur when something is so theoretical. And that's exactly what Louis Vuitton or LVMH did. I mean, I've spoken to the scientists that are working on lab grown fur, and they're saying that they were specifically making it for Fendi, and they said this is about 10 years in the making to get maybe a small sample. So I think LVMH is on the defense right now, and it's because of the work that you all are doing, which is really, really great. But back to open dialogue, I think one of the really important parts of open dialogue is it gives you an opportunity to reach the right people within an organization and get the facts to them. In my experience, it's money still talks. And so being able to show them how they can do well by going for free, I think is really important. And getting them information like this. So, I mean, just showing them that the public opinion across the world is against fur, showing them that, this is a report that was done by Vogue recently, showing them that animal welfare is the number one priority for consumers when they're buying fashion goods. And a lot of this is being led by Gen Z consumers. As you can see here, Gen Z consumers are the first generation where animal welfare is the number one priority when buying luxury goods, which is just that makes every brand so shocked, because they weren't even asking their customers at the time, what do you care about? Because if they did, and there's a handful of companies that have, including Kering, including Selfridges, when they ask their customers, what do they care about? Animal welfare is always a top priority. And then they look at their policies and saying, what are we doing about that? And the answer generally was, not too long ago, not a whole lot. And one thing that is also changing right now is just the focus on financial institutions and ESG engagement. And so we're seeing big financial companies move away from fur, not wanting to fund fur anymore. And investors are rewarding companies for being strong on environmental issues. This is what ESG stands for: environmental, social, and corporate governance. And so being strong on those is really the next wave of investments, where investors are going to demand that the companies that they invest in are taking these issues seriously and creating policies, and fur is part of that. And also what we're seeing is this innovation improving. This is Koba fur, which is Stella McCartney worked with a company called EcoPel on that, and it's actually bio-based, so corn-based faux fur. I spoke to another company last week called BioFluff, which is also a plant-based faux fur, because it was interesting when the fur trade was hurting. They shifted their talking points away from talking about animal welfare at all. They don't even talk about it anymore. Because they lost that argument. But what they do say is faux fur is bad for the environment. And that's their major talking point right now. But because of, so many companies going for free and so many cities and states banning fur sales at this point, they're recognizing that, faux fur they need to improve that. And so it's getting better, not just in quality, but environmental reasons as well. So just take a drink. So why do we work on fur sales instead of production? What we found, and this was, years of Europe, going back to 2000 when the UK banned fur production. And as you can see in the dark teal, so many other countries have. What we saw was that just when the demand was still there, production just shifted. And so like when the Netherlands announced that they were going to phase out fur farming, suddenly all those farmers just moved to Poland, and now Poland is one of the top fur producing countries in the world. So it didn't really impact the demand. One thing that is helpful is when you do ban fur production, it becomes a really helpful talking point when you're trying to ban fur sales, like the UK is trying to do. They banned fur production in 2000 because they thought it was too cruel to produce, but they're also okay with importing, hundreds of millions of pounds of fur products every year. And it just doesn't make sense. If we're not okay producing it, we shouldn't be importing that cruelty either. But just like the corporate policies decrease the demand for fur products, this is what happens when you really focus on fur sales. You want to eliminate the demand. You want to reduce the price point for those pelts, so that they're no longer economically viable. And that's going to close those fur farms automatically. And it becomes a logistical nightmare when you have fur sales bans in all these cities at this point, for brands like LVMH to sell fur. Similar to how the circus, how Ringling was closed by all these bullhook bans across the nation, creating this logistical nightmare for brands, saying we can't sell in this city, but we can sell in this city. More times than not, they're just going to say, we're not going to deal with that, and we're just going to go for free. And so this is the current situation of where we are with fur sales bans. California in 2019 became the first, and that was primarily because 4 of its major cities went fur-free first. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berkeley, and West Hollywood. So I think it shows it's the impact of starting at the local level and building up from there. We've seen a lot of cities follow suit, specifically in Massachusetts, where we're hopefully going to have another fur sales ban at the state level. But then Israel became the first country to ban it, and I think the UK is not far behind. One thing to consider when looking at this map is, according to 2017 economic census data, we know where fur sales in 2017 were mostly made, and California was the #1 state for fur sales, believe it or not, and New York is close behind. So if fur sales were banned in California and Hawaii, that is half of all the fur sales in the United States gone. I'm sure it will shift to other states, but that is a huge blow to the fur trade. Other states that are in the top, 5 are Texas, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Michigan. But also states like Illinois, Florida, Pennsylvania, Virginia are all in the top 10 for fur sales. So it's how do we strategically start chipping away in those states to eventually get to a statewide ban. So what exactly does a fur sales ban do? Again, we want to reduce the demand for new fur products. So the ban is specifically only on new fur, not used fur. So thrift stores, secondhand stores, pawn shops would still be able to sell used fur. It also does not apply to leather or shearling, and does not stop people from owning fur. It just stops retailers from selling new fur. There's also exemptions for native tribes and religious purposes that are considered at a state by or city by city case. And my pitch to you all is that if you want to close the furriers in your community, if you want to, stop the LVMH from selling a fur at a retail store, and creating a nightmare for them, and if we want to end the fur trade for good, I think we need to come together and not only support each other on getting these fur sales bans by Louis Vuitton and so many of these brands, but also working at the local level with our city council to ban fur sales, to make sure this trend or this trade never comes back as acceptable ever again. And I know that, I saw Jess, I saw Matthew. I mean, these are people that are spearheading the fur sales bans in their communities, and advocates in Chicago, Minneapolis, Portland, Austin, Southern Florida, Colorado, Massachusetts, New Jersey. They're all working on passing these fur sales bans to close out the industry for good. And the fur industry is hurting right now. It never rebounded from COVID. And then on top of that, you have the sanctions that are happening from Russia, which is leading to a further dip in demand. So really now is the time that I think we learned from what we learned in the 80s and 90s, and all work together to end this trade. And just kind of what we're seeing as the next steps is that companies now recognize, because they went for free, because they got all that positive reinforcement, and they recognize that their consumers care about animal welfare, and they're going to continue to align their policies with their consumers' values, and they love that promotion that they're getting. So there's this kind of feeling amongst the fashion community now that they want to be, it's like a competition of who's the best on animal welfare at this point. So you're seeing some of these big brands coming out, and it's not just saying fur, but they're going to be banning exotic skins as well. And where I see this happening, or how I see this playing out, is really retailers, and where the general public is against using animals that are raised specifically for fashion. So that is a python, that is a fox or a crocodile. And there still is a little gray area for brands and consumers on products that are, raised for food production. For the longest time, those brands, they would just say, you know what, that's the beef industry. The leather is just a byproduct of that. And so we can continue to use it. And I think that's kind of what consumers believe as well. So what's happening on those front is that's where innovation is happening. I see it similar to what happened to Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers, where the money was finally being pumped into some of these alternatives, which allowed them to scale very, very quickly. And we're seeing that with leather, where every brand out there wants, the next generation of leather. So we're talking, that's the Hermes bag with mushroom leather, and H&M uses grape leather now. And I think that this is going to be really the future. I think that there's going to be the quality is going to be there at one point. It's going to be cheaper, and it's not going to have the environmental impact or the impact on animals. So that's really the future, and I'm really excited about your questions, and I'll stop sharing, but go from there. But thank you all, and please, if you email me if you're interested in doing a fur sales ban in your community. The one thing that I do really hope is that we're able to draft that language for you, to make sure that there's no preemption concerns in your state, and to make sure that we really thoughtfully look at what sort of exemptions we want to put in there. But I think that's really step one. And I said that there was a toolkit. I forgot I didn't mention it, but there's a toolkit that kind of walks you through step by step. But I think it's also just be great to get connected with other activists in those communities that are working on fur sales bans, because I mean it's really important to show, obviously, strength in numbers and meeting with city council and showing them that you're not going to give up on this. But it's also great to show that, trying to show that the business community is behind this, because that's what's led to us being able to work on fur sales bans is that enough companies went fur free that you can now show that the fashion community is behind this, and the retail community is behind this. Like, no one outside of your local furrier is selling these fur garments anymore, and they need to be closed down because they've just been around for so long, and there's no place for that sort of cruelty anymore. So yeah, please contact me. Follow us on Facebook. I post all the time about fur stuff. But yeah, thank you.
So now I guess we'll do Q&A. So I see a couple of hands raised, or actually I see one hand raised. You can either raise your hand and I'll call on you to ask your question, or you can go ahead and put it in the message chat and I can read it out and field it to PJ. If you want to, well, first I'll go with the question from Matt. Is the toolkit on the HSUS website?
Yeah, I don't have the specific URL, but if you search for HSUS toolkit for click on the first link and you'll see the toolkit there.
Awesome. And then I have one hand raised. Don't see a name. It's just a phone number listed. So if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Okay, hi, can you hear me? I'm Dee Dee from Western North Carolina.
Yes.
Okay, so my big thing with faux fur is that it's promoting fur. So I just didn't know how you guys felt about that. When I was interning with HSUS many, many years ago, I had mentioned to Pierre and a couple of other people that it seems to me like there should be some type of symbol, because faux fur, faux leather, they look so much like it. It's promoting fur and leather.
Yeah, that is a common thing we hear, and I would say that not all brands immediately switch to faux fur. I think a lot of them don't even want to promote the look at all. I think one thing that I considered, or one thing that that helped change my mind on that, was that this was an aesthetic, because we would meet with the fashion students at certain schools, and a lot of them just wanted that look, that look on a jacket or something like that, and it was really hard to taken away a sort of aesthetic for somebody of creative mind, and so if you really want that look, you want that feel, you have an opportunity to do that with faux fur. As far as like a pin, I would just say that there's been so many companies that have tried to do that. One that comes to mind is Imposter Faux Fur. They were trying to do like a really beautiful pin that was going on the jackets. We sell the little heart pins that say fur with a cross through it, and I think that if you're concerned about that, I think it's really, then throw a pin on it for sure. I think they get that message. I know people that have written, not real fur on their entire back of their faux fur jacket, whatever you find to be appropriate. But yeah, I think that is a concern. We are going to get to a place where, when we're at a place now where the leather shoes are indistinguishable. I'm biting into an Impossible Burger that's bleeding. I don't know if that's getting the table next to me to want a real burger, but hopefully we just get to a point where we automatically know that all of this is going to be faux fur or lab grown fur if LVMH ever has their way. But yeah,
what I like about Impossible Burger and everything else is that it's very well marked. Everybody knows. So, when you're buying it or eating it, you're making that choice. Whereas, you can see it on the wrapper. Whereas when you're walking down the street, I'll never forget, we were doing a fur protest in Skinny Atlas, New York, where we did it almost every year in the winter. And this woman walked by with this incredibly, well, I don't want to really call it beautiful, but beautiful fur coat. And we were just like, oh my gosh, how can you wear that? She said it's faux fur, so that was my point, is that she's promoting fur. We all thought it was fur. And I was just hoping, someday that they'd come up with like a symbol that they could just easily etch in like FF or faux fur, FL for faux leather. And they could just, you know, put it like in the back of the heel, maybe in the back middle of top of a fur coat or something, or on the lapel. I just think that just like if you're doing a brand symbol like Ralph Lauren on the shirt, it seems to me like they could have come up with some type of symbolism for all of that.
Yeah, one thing that's been interesting, you know how, you know, Oatly and faux or and plant-based milks and have skyrocketed, and the dairy industry has you know, fought back by, you know, challenging them for saying that it's called butter or milk or things like that. In Italy, they passed a law a couple of years ago that said you can't call it faux fur. You can't use the word fur with a prefix that says faux. Same with leather. So Stella McCartney, that has a very nice thing on her faux fur jacket. It says fur free fur. I think she has to remove all of those labels in Italy because of that. So they're already fighting back pretty hard.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Jessica.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious, like your thoughts on like fur sales bans versus like sales, manufacturing, and production all together as one. Like, I know for Chicago specifically, sales seems to be, you know, the right way to go. But once we, you know, hopefully take it statewide, what are your thoughts on like focusing just on production or doing a ban that's both for sales and production because of all the fur farms in like the rural areas?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, California didn't have any fur farms, and so that was never anything that they had to consider. And I think when it comes to our legal team that writes a lot of the legislation, they want to keep things as simple as possible and really get to the heart of what the issue is. And the issue is people selling and buying fur. And so I know in California, it was considered a manufacturing ban. The one thing that I would say about that is again, I don't know that there's a whole lot of manufacturing going on. Most of the fur that we produce immediately goes overseas and becomes products, and then it comes back to us as products. So the manufacturing is not even really here. But for legislators, it's a really scary thing to you know, stop manufacturing in your state, and that could deter some really pro-business that find, you know, fur cruel, but they still don't want to seem like those workers can't sew that fur or something like that. So that's one thing to consider, and why we focus just again on fur sales. But I think in Washington and Oregon have two running bills, and they're separate. So one is a ban on fur production, one's ban on fur sales. So I think there is if you put those two things together, they would be in different, you know, codes of the legislature, and it becomes a little bit more confusing and complex. So I think that there is a really wanting to focus. This one's on fur sales, this one's on fur ban or fur production. And so I would say that most likely they would recommend doing the same in Illinois, having two separate bills.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess.
Don't see any more hands raised, and I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm gonna ask one myself. What would you say you might think the most strategic way for maybe a new activist or even a seasoned activist to get involved with helping to end the fur trade, whether that be boots on the ground, whether it be joining CAFT, whether it be you know, talking with local fur retailers? What do you think the best way for someone to get started, or again, ramp up their activism is?
Yeah, I would say it's doing what Jess is doing. Jess, you said you've been activist for about a year, I believe.
Yeah, it'll be a full year, August 15th.
Good. Okay, there's an anniversary coming up. That's exciting. No, Jess is what she's doing is she's obviously preparing herself with all the facts about the fur trade, and she is really leading the charge in Chicago by meeting with city council members individually and talking to them about fur sales bans. She's not only learning the process of what it takes to pass an ordinance in Chicago, but she's going to forever be recognizable to those legislators and is going to be able to say, okay, what about a foie gras ban? And Jess is going to be the go-to for that kind of stuff. And obviously a big part of working with city council members is showing that there is a business supports this, local Chicago business supports this. And so Jess and her team in Chicago and her is actually working with the local businesses to be like going in there and saying, what do you guys think about supporting this ban on fur sales? And that's so important. And she's able to talk to the local businesses and get them on board. And that's just so many different levels of driving this message home, not just on fur, but veganism in general, educating so many brands, educating so many local retailers. And once you have them on board, and that they feel like they're engaged on this issue. Like I said, I in my experience, it leads to additional things when they arise. So thank you, Jess, for doing that. Chicago, Matthew's doing that in Portland. I'm sure there's other people that are doing that in their cities and states, but I think it's such a crucial thing that we can do is work on the public policy side of stuff, not just on animal welfare, but all issues too. Like engage in your local government. It's how you're going to change it and how you're going to make things better in your local city. And there's not many people doing it. That's what's shocking to me is like you can make this massive change if you just got to know the 6 people in your community, 6 or a crazy number of council members in Chicago, but like in other communities, there's like 6 people that represent your whole community and pass the laws that are there, and you just have to meet with them. They meet with you if you want to, and it's I believe the most effective thing you can do to create change.
Excellent. Okay, next up we have John Bell, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yes. During when a company announces that they're going to be going away from fur, is there any oversight in place to monitor what they do with the animals that are currently in their farms, whatever, to make sure they're taken care of well and not disposed of, whatever?
You mean oversight to make sure they're following their fur-free commitment?
What I'm saying, any animals that they currently have in their stream of manufacturing or the farms, is there any way to make sure that those animals are not somehow disposed of and taken care of? Obviously, we know they made a commitment to stop and get out of the industry, but what happens to all the animals they still have in their hands?
Yeah, I mean, the brands won't necessarily have, direct connection with the fur farms directly. A lot of them will, there's a bunch of middlemen in between, the brands that get the products and the farms that produce the fur. And it is very fluid. I mean, one thing to consider that every year, all the animals are wiped out of these fur farms. And then it just it depends on how much money they made that previous year. It dictates how many animals they produce the following year. And so what we've seen is just the number of animals that are being produced or farmed is going down drastically because they're not getting the prices that they want at auction. And so as long as we can keep on, eliminating that demand then less and less animals are going to be farmed, and hopefully a lot of these fur farms will close, which will lead to legislation that will ban it for good. Trying to think. Yeah, in Italy, something that's interesting is Italy just banned mink fur production, and so they have, I think, around 10,000 mink that are still sitting at the fur farms waiting for the government to decide what to do with them. And I think the Minister of Agriculture made some sort of commitment saying that they were going to rehome the mink. And we're talking about 10,000 mink that are an invasive species in Europe that require pools and a whole bunch of things that would lead to a good life for that mink, and there just aren't enough homes for those mink in there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but in some of those situations, a peaceful euthanasia is probably going to be the best way to not be in a cage anymore, but to consider that these animals are dying every year anyway. Yeah, we just want to make sure that there's no demand for it the following year.
Yeah, that's what my concern was, because if all of a sudden many companies do the same thing and they have hundreds and thousands of animals still in their care, they can't just go and dump them back into the environment.
Yeah, the thing with most of the fur-free announcements is their phase outs. So anytime, like when Neiman Marcus, Saks Fifth Avenue, Canada Goose, all their fur policies, I don't think by quite coincidence, go into effect the same day that California's fur sales ban goes into effect. And so that I mean, they made those announcements, over a year or two ago. So they've had years to slow down production to get to that zero. So it isn't automatic like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John.
All right, I have one more hand up. Again, just a phone number, so if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Dee Dee again from Western North Carolina. I just wanted to make a comment on getting involved with your city and county councils, which I could not agree more. I go to as many city and county council meetings as I can about any animal welfare issue. And along those lines, I also strongly urge people to even run for city or county council or a state rep or federal, congressmen, congresswomen. And I also, which doesn't come up frequently either, is voting for animals, which I do as well. And I look at the Humane Scorecard with the Humane Society Legislative Fund, and I check out who is either environmentally friendly or animal friendly, even on the very, very local level. And lastly, I've been going to political meetings, and when they bring a candidate to the meeting, I ask them how they feel about animal welfare. They have no idea what to say. So I just think that if you get involved in many, many angles that way too, politically, I think that that is also helpful.
100%. Thank you.
Sounds like another great idea for maybe a continuation workshop to go into more detail on maybe getting involved in those areas. Maybe Jessica would like to
lead it.
Yeah. Cool.
I was actually just saying that whoever's on this call right now that's like also working on campaigns in other cities, like I would love to, get together and kind of just talk and collaborate with you. That was it. So I don't know, maybe we can all like share each other's phone numbers or contact information. That would be cool.
Definitely. I'm going to put mine in the chat right now. I would love to chat more.
Yeah.
There's one thing that says, what does opposition look like globally, from Peter? I would say, Europe, I think is leading this. For those who don't know, there is a thing called a European Citizens Initiative, ECI, that Eurogroup for Animals and the Fur Free Alliance and so many organizations in Europe are pushing right now, that it is if they can gather 1 million signatures within a year, calendar year, and I think it started in May, and they're up to like 250, close to 300,000 at this point, that the European Commission has to respond to their question, and their question or their demand is to ban fur production within the EU and to ban products that come from fur farms into the EU marketplace. So there's no sort of guarantee that any of that's happening, but it's something that's going to show a lot of legislators, a lot of MEPs that in Europe that this is something that their constituents care about, and hopefully leads to a production ban, which then would shift most likely all production to China at that point. But yeah, that's a long time in the making. But I would say that Europe and Western world is predominantly against the fur trade. But it's interesting when a company like Kering specifically asked their Chinese consumers, Chinese luxury consumers that were Gen Z, so very specific. They said that animal welfare was, I think, the second highest priority for them. So again, this is showing that this when you get a company like Gucci and Dolce Gabbana and Prada, and that are so popular in China and in Korea and countries that make a stand on animal welfare, it does resonate with them and it does make an impact. And we're seeing pet ownership and go up in China. So I think that the tides are turning, which will be huge impact. Cool.
Awesome. Okay, does anybody have any last burning questions or comments that they want to either put in the chat or raise your hand? And if not, okay, Matt.
Hey, PJ.
Hey, Matthew.
Kind of a long day. I'm a little zoomed out, and I have a little bit of a tough question for you, but you know, a major barrier to passing these bans in Portland and Oregon has been concerns from politicians about like the racial tensions. Like we have Native American populations here. You touched on exemptions a little bit, but I was wondering if you had any advice about how to best talk about that, or how to reach out to groups that might be impacted by a ban to best, you know, get them on board and mitigate those issues before, you know, it becomes an issue.
Yeah, so this is what kind of stalled Washington's fur sales ban last year. The native tribes came out, and they have a lot of influence with legislators there. I think the one thing that was really important to understand was the need to have that conversation before we introduce this sort of legislation, not only just to explain the exemptions and how there is an exemption for native tribes and using fur for tribal purposes. So because most tribes are, you know, not okay with fur farming in general, but they have a long tradition of, you know, trapping and hunting and using those pelts. So explaining that there is an exemption in there, but I think just being able to have their voice heard and having that open dialogue is really important. And I think we saw the same in New York, where it was with the African American community, saying that fur had a significant, like a cultural significance, specifically to Black churches where people would wear fur. And again, I think this is something that if these conversations happened prior, and I think the animal welfare movement in general needs to do better at DEI issues and bringing in all voices, so that we can understand the issues a little bit better. And so I think that there's just like being committed to open dialogue is really important. as far as like reaching out to the community. In Washington, we were lucky enough that the sponsor of the bill was actually a tribal liaison, and so he can directly connect us with the tribes that were in opposition to the fur sales ban. But I think hopefully there would be a champion or somebody on city council in Portland. I know you're struggling, Matthew, but to find that champion that's going to connect you with them. So we do know that the fur trade is trying. You're going to use every tactic that they can to continue to sell their product, and they want to create that divide. They want to create that racial divide. It's what we saw in California. And it was immediately shot down by the head of the Black Caucus, where he says, I find it offensive that you would somehow link my race to the animal cruelty behind the fur trade. But that did catch on in New York City, and it did eventually end the momentum that the sales ban in New York City had. And so I think what the local groups led by Voters for Animal Rights in New York, they're reaching out to the Black community and having those conversations, reaching out to the Hasidic Jewish community that wears fur for religious purposes, and having that conversation. And I think that goes a long way.
Awesome, thank you. It was a great talk.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, what a really inspiring workshop. Thanks, PJ. I do have a couple announcements, unless anyone has any last questions or comments. All right, so I'd just like to announce a few upcoming workshops. On August 18th is A Kinder Kaporos with Jewish Veg. On August 25th is an insider look at the poultry industry with Karen Davis. September 20th is animal advocacy using social media with social media influencer John Oberg. And then I'd also like to announce our next live event. First of all, we have one live event going on right now, which is our 10 days of activism in Chicago against the fur industry. So as we speak right now, many activists joining Animal Activism Mentorship are on the streets in Chicago, going pretty hard against Louis Vuitton and other affiliated retailers. So if you'd like to be a part of that, you still have until, I believe, this Saturday. So that's every day, pretty much from dusk till dawn, activism nonstop. And it's with Animal Activism Mentorship, which means there'll be mentors and mentees. So mentors are experienced activists, and mentees are either new activists or activists looking for help to either ramp up their activism, or maybe they haven't done any activism at all before. So if you want to join with that, feel free to reach out to AAM, or again, it's going on in Chicago right now. So it's on both of the social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, lives happening every day. And then the next in-person event is the AAM Ohio Occurrence, which is a 3-day animal rights activism event in Cleveland, Ohio. This event will feature several different types of animal rights activism. The dates are September 2nd through the 4th. So check out our page for more details, and please register in advance. And then that wraps up another AAM workshop. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, PJ, for your time and wisdom. Thank you everyone for the work that you're doing for animals all around the world. And if you're interested in becoming a mentor or a mentee, or you want to get involved with any of our activism, please reach out to any AAM mentor or visit our website, animalactivismmentorship.com. In the meantime, we will add you all to our email newsletter list if you would like. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now.